Hello, happy Monday. I'm filming this episode on Monday morning from my panic room. It's the last week of classes. My hunch is that most students are pretty happy to see this semester coming to an end. I don't disagree with that in the slightest. I'm honestly going to be pretty happy to see this end as well. But we have 1 week left to really commit ourselves to our grades here. And that's what I encourage us all to do. 1 week left to use these academic resources, 1 week left to learn. And for those of you that are seniors, my heart goes out to you. You have 1 week left to be a college student. It breaks my heart to see y'all go out this way, but nevertheless, you got 1 week left, and you have 1 week left in these circumstances that nobody has any control over. So use it, right? Use it to be a student for one final week, and let me know if I can help you do that in any way. Want to spend today thinking long term. I want to think about the abstract philosophical future of cities. Okay. So to give a little insight of what I mean by that, last week, especially when I was talking about Buffalo, I was talking very structurally about cities of the future. Thinking about urban areas in a new environmental or climate reality, that was about the cities of the future. In other words, what cities are going to look like. However, if we change that ordering of the words there, I don't think it's the same as expressing the future of cities. Okay, let me explain what I mean by this. Cities of the future and the future of cities. You change the wording and the ordering there, and I think it refers to something fundamentally different. Cities of the future is a question of what cities are going to look like to deal with new structural realities of the 21st century. The future of cities is much more about how they're going to operate, what they will be used for, how we as a society and as a culture are going to conceptualize cities and their place within local, national, and international hierarchies. So in a way, I'm kind of operating here from a process assumption. Like instead of just like what is set up in cities, how are they going to actually look? I want to think a little bit more about the process here, because that process is very, very flexible to changes in priorities, and it's very flexible to changes in our ability to, not our ability, but it's very flexible in the face of changing priorities. One of the things that I hope I've made clear over the past few months is that cities are not dropped out of the sky fully formed. They take the form they do to reflect what the priorities of the population are, and then most importantly, power dynamics within those populations. There is a legend in Russia, like not a belief, nobody believes it, but there's a legend that's told in Russia about St. Petersburg, that God dropped St. Petersburg out of the sky and it landed fully formed on the banks of the Volga River. Obviously, that's not how cities take form. Urbanization is a process, and urbanism is a way of life. Let's talk about the process of creating cities and the way of life that takes place within those cities. And to do that, I want to go through about seven. I think I have 7 thoughts about the future of cities. And I want to go through those one at a time to give you something to think about. And I hope that some of these ideas or some of these ideologies make an appearance in your final research paper, in your ability to think a little bit long term about a current problem and what the city, like the future of cities, can be used for in order to bring that problem into a solution, or to bring that problem or that issue into a more sustainable urban setting and a more sustainable way of life for people. So last week we talked a lot about sustainability. The underlining thing of that is I look at creating environmentally sustainable cities as a way to create a sustainable happiness level among the population. In order to be happy, we have to have our basic needs met, obviously, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's actually very little evidence, both historically and in a contemporary way, that people are happier today than they were in, say, the 15th century. Because people's happiness levels comes out of what they expect for their lives. And just adding higher levels of wealth is not a proven strategy to make people happier. Obviously, we need our basic needs met, but what even qualifies as a basic need? That's open to a lot of social interpretation. So here's just a few simple demographic realities. Over the next 50 years, the United States is going to grow by 100 million people. We're going to add 100 million people to this country over the next half a century. And within that demographic increase, there's three cohorts that I want to focus on here. The percentage of people who are over the age of 65 is going to double. The percentage or proportion of people over the age of 85, that's going to triple. And the proportion of current ethnic minorities is going to comprise 50% of the population. Put another way, the group minority, ethnically speaking, is going to collectively not be a minority, okay? And that, I hope you understand what I mean there. Like, each group will still be a minority, but collectively, minorities will together become a majority. And that's definitely unprecedented in the country's recent history. This is what I think of as a kind of marginalized majority. Just look at what is happening right now in the face of the COVID-19 epidemic, or pandemic, I should say, is the accurate term right now. Just look at what's happening. People with pre-existing health issues or underlying conditions are getting walloped by this. And that's perhaps not surprising, but there's a lot of articles being written about the vulnerability of the elderly population and the vulnerability of minorities. If you look at Chicago, Detroit, and New Orleans, the rate of coronavirus deaths among those cities' Black population is stunning. It's outrageously high. As of, I realize this data could be outdated at this point, but as of about a week ago, Blacks comprised over 70% of all deaths from the coronavirus in Chicago. Over 70%. And I think that is not inevitable. Okay, so if we look at groups that have historically been pushed to the social fringes, which is absolutely descriptive of the historical institutional treatment of racial and ethnic minorities, and is absolutely descriptive of the social treatment of the elderly population. This is a marginalized group, and it's about to become a marginalized majority. The city is a tool. Remember what I said on like the first week of class. I want you to think of cities as spaces of inequality, and I want you to see them as networks. And those networks can be leveraged to alleviate the inequality, the iniquities that are built into the very nature of our urban areas. So the city is a tool. Right now, we use that tool for wealth. And that's not a bad thing. Wealth is important. But there's very little evidence that just adding wealth to a situation makes everybody happier in a sustainable way. In a lot of ways, it just kind of creates a whole bunch of mini explosions in our life. What tends to create sustainable happiness is a permanent reduction in our stress levels. What tends to create a permanent increase in happiness is a sustainable increase in the type of purpose that people feel, okay? One of the really interesting case studies on this is one of the fastest economically developing case studies we have in the 20th century. In a very quick time frame, the country of South Korea went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the wealthiest. There's absolutely no evidence that people in South Korea are happier today than they were when it was one of the poorest countries in the world. How could that be? I mean, because part of that is there's certain advances that come with getting wealthier that everybody wants to keep. Because, for example, life expectancy, people's health, and people's ability to live longer and healthier lives, it's gone way up in South Korea. Life expectancy has increased 35 years. Infant mortality has absolutely plummeted in South Korea. But to just put on my globalist hat here, there's just no evidence that they're happier in a very sustainable or recognizable way. Okay. So if we look at the countries that are ranked some of the happiest in the world, you get places like Denmark, which is one of the wealthiest, but you also get places like Costa Rica, which is not one of the wealthiest. So nobody wants to be the poorest country in the world. But what the countries have in common, the countries, oh, and also one of the unhappiest countries in the world is France. The French are always upset about something. And again, they have very high levels of wealth. What tends to create sustainable happiness is a belief that my life is going somewhere, and a belief that there's not a ton of stress embedded within my life. The Danes have that, the Costa Ricans have that, the French do not have that, and Americans absolutely do not have that. So, my worry is that groups of people already prone to chronic stress, the elderly and ethnic minorities, they're going to become a very marginalized majority. And as long as the city is conceptualized as simply a place to generate exchange value, as long as the city becomes the sum of its real estate deals, um, that will increase stress and decrease happiness levels among a growing segment of the urban population. And that's important for cities because that 100 million people that are getting added to the American population, almost all of that will be added to cities. Okay. Um, One more word on this. I am aware, I've talked to a couple of my students, and I'm aware that it's an idea among people your age. There seems to be a lot of anger among 20 and 21-year-olds at the moment for getting left out of the recent stimulus act, which, I got back on Wednesday. I got a $1,200 check just plopped into my account. And so most college students, not all, but most, missed out on that payment. Because most of you still live at home with parents, and that means that you're claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax returns, and people claimed as dependents are not getting that payment. That's a bad break. I get it, and I recognize that that's a bad break. And I hope that future legislation includes the needs of very young adults in it. And who knows? Maybe if you're claimed as a dependent, your parents just got an extra $500, so maybe you can make a deal with them for that. I don't know, probably not. But here's what I would say long term about that. Short term, I want you guys to get something. Long term, if $1,200 is that big of a deal to you, just imagine what a real social safety net could do for you, right? Just imagine what universal health care and publicly funded education systems would ultimately do for you. And that's a reason why people in Denmark seem so depressed, but always report being very happy. They're not a very stressed population. And that leads me to my next point, the idea of pragmatism. We are currently in a bitterly polarized national political culture. Okay, I'll explain why I have Thomas the Tank Engine here in just a minute. It's a pretty bitterly polarized political culture, nationally speaking. And at the national level, you get to argue over ideology. Locally, though, problems need solving. You can run a dysfunctional national government and get away with it if people buy into your ideology. You can run an inefficient national government and get away with it if enough people buy into your ideology. But at the local level, you just don't see this being realistic. The overwhelming majority of people are what's known as local moderates, where they may have ideological feelings about, say, something like immigration, but locally, those people are now your neighbors, and people are not usually arguing at the local level for large-scale deportations. No, they're arguing for that at the national level because it's affecting people in Arizona, let's say, that I'm never going to be neighbors with, that I'm never going to see. And this is where cities thrive. They become an element of realpolitik, to use Otto von Bismarck's famous German terminology. You got to solve problems, right? People want the trains to run on time, right? They want Thomas to be a useful engine. Here's a story on this. I study Europe. It's my primary research angle is the European politics and society, European protest levels. Here's what I think. Take a case study like the European refugee crisis, which led to a couple million people flooding out of the Middle East and North Africa and crossing dangerous pathways and waters, either through the northern or the eastern Mediterranean to get to Greece and to get to Italy and to hopefully get to a better life in Europe. Just as an aside on this, I was in Greece in the summer of 2019, and through my time there, I was there with another Albion professor and a few other people from other GLCA colleges. We got to see we got to spend time at two refugee camps on the island of Lesbos in Greece. One is called the Karatepe refugee camp, and it is generally viewed as it's kind of a model for the holding of a human population, of a refugee population. It's run by a director who's, he's Spanish, he's ex-military. He knows the system. He understands like the realities of traveling and displaced people from war zones. It's something he's seen before, and he runs a pretty functional refugee camp, very little rates of violence, very little rates of low rates of sexual abuse. And then just a few miles away on the same island, you have the Moira refugee camp, and that place is hell on earth, right? The New York Times has written a bunch of articles about the Moira refugee camp, and it is hell on earth. I cannot stress that enough. That's the one, the people who direct that don't want people coming in. I'll just say that. So we only got to see it from the outside. So why am I telling you this? Well, you had in very short order about 1 million people that traveled from various countries in the Middle East and North Africa to Germany. And nationally speaking, there was a big debate about whether or not this was a good idea for Germany to bring in such a large refugee population. And there was a famous interview, well, famous to me, I guess, probably other people don't really know about it very much, but I became aware of it because where do you think these people ended up going? The vast majority ended up in cities, at least at the start of their European lives. And people were the mayor of Hamburg was asked, do you agree with Chancellor Merkel's policies here of openness and welcoming to Syrian refugees? And the mayor of Hamburg's response was, I don't care, right? Because what he said was, look, whether I agree with this or not is of absolutely no consequence because they're here. And that means as the mayor of this city, I need to make sure they have beds to sleep in. I need to make sure they have a structure to integrate. I need to make sure that they have a way to learn the German language, which would obviously do tremendous things for their labor market opportunities within the German culture. I need to make sure that their children have schools to go to. Doesn't matter what I think ideologically. What matters is that the trains run on time, so to speak. All right. And if we think about everything in that type of pragmatism that is so common within urban areas, I hope that things get a lot easier. Okay. And part of the way that we can do that is by diversifying leadership, because people who come from certain communities usually, not exclusively, but usually have have a better idea of what the needs of that population are. Okay, different cohorts of people, different populations have different needs within cities. The negotiating tables then, I think, do better when they reflect that diversity. Although, even though the negotiating tables are probably not diverse enough, I will say, just from my anecdotal sort of take on the situation, it kind of seems that one of the more diverse political offices in the country is the mayorship, the mayor's office. What I'm showing you here, this is Eric Garcetti, the current mayor of Los Angeles, one of the biggest cities in the country. He is LA's second consecutive Mexican American mayor. Second consecutive, and that reflects the diversity of the Los Angeles's population. In my opinion, I think he is a much better mayor than Villaraigosa, the guy that he replaced, who you may remember. Both Villaraigosa and Garcetti were both mentioned in the Garden, that documentary that I assigned for you. But here's the point: if I want to have some urban pragmatism, then it becomes very important to listen to the community. It becomes very important to listen to a diverse type of leadership within the community. And that's where local city councils can play a major role. And that's where local leadership can really push the negotiating forward in a very functional way. Now, granted, I realize everything I'm saying here, there's a counter argument to, which is it could just get caught up in corruption. Yeah, fair enough. It could. It certainly could. But that's not far off from where we are at the moment anyway. Now, the fourth thing I want to talk about here is this divide between cities and technology. We are moving into an area of smart cities. Now, how is that going to play out? On the one hand, we have urbanists, and often people who self-identify as an urbanist are often, that's a signaling mechanism. That's a way of saying, I like dense, walkable cities with public transportation and parks, I guess. But these are the people who have to plan cities, they manage cities, and they think about cities, most importantly. On the other hand, you have technologists. Those are people who are much better at building new products and building new services. There is currently a massive cultural divide between these groups. They often talk in completely different languages, not literally, but figuratively. The jargon that they use, the way that they think about cities is very different. A lot of urbanists are always talking about urban stability and placemaking. Technologists are often talking about disruption of the status quo. So take something like Uber. Uber did reflect a real need within urban populations, the fact that it was sometimes very difficult to get a taxi. But now the urban transportation system has been completely disrupted by this. And obviously everybody wants to focus on the people who drive cabs, right? It's made the medallions that you can buy into to get a cab kind of worthless through the use of Uber. But what we're kind of seeing right now is a very troubling trend where many cities are not investing or cutting investment in public transportation because, hey, Uber will just take care of it, right? That will just take care of it. Here's the problem with that. For one, Uber makes gridlock and it makes traffic worse. The case is closed on that. Like there's been no situation where it's found to make gridlock and traffic better. But also, it's less green. It's less green to have even more driving sort of happening. But then perhaps most importantly and lesser known is the fact that Uber does not make money. Uber has never made a profit in its life. And that doesn't mean it's a bad company. You know, another company that didn't make a profit for a decade straight, Amazon. But they played the long game, right? They played the long game. They drove everybody else out of business, and now they run shit. In the case of Uber, though, they have to maintain their market share by subsidizing the crap out of these rides to get you to take them. Once Uber becomes profitable and once there are not many options for anything else, what do you think is going to happen to the price of those rides? They're probably not going to stay as cheap as they currently are. So for smart cities to thrive, there's an important partnership here, right? The people that make these elements of disruption need to place them into the city in a way that actually improves people's lives. Another example internationally of this type of urban technology is the massive level of urban surveillance that is currently going on in Chinese cities. Smart cities, technologically based cities, it allows the Chinese regime to have the closest thing we have in the world to Big Brother in Beijing and Shanghai, in Chinese cities. And I maybe you saw back when the coronavirus was really just a Chinese thing. Remember that? There was that famous video that was going around of a Chinese woman leaving her apartment, and immediately a drone was on top of her with a speaker on it that was yelling at her, saying, "Go back inside, put on a mask, don't come outside if you don't have to," right? That level of surveillance. Where do you think that came from? Well, it came from the wiring, the creating of a city with eyes everywhere. And maybe that helps them police public behavior during an unprecedented global pandemic, or it allows them to lock up Muslim dissidents in the north, or it allows them to lock up pro-democracy dissidents in Hong Kong. You got to think about the social consequences of technology. And as long as the people who plan cities and the people who create technology are speaking a fundamentally different language, that's going to create a lot of problems, I think. Okay? Speaking of technology and Amazon, I would encourage cities to resist the big fix kind of idea. I would focus my investments on neighborhoods and institutions and less on what's the big corporate thing that I can announce as being the hallmark of my time in the mayor's office. And so I would just add, do you really think, does anybody really want to argue that the city that got the second Amazon headquarters, and that's going to solve every single one of your problems? I personally thought it struck me as like the competition, every city bending over backwards to lure that new Amazon headquarters to their city. And there was like 75 that seriously competed over this. It was the growth machine at work, right? It was the city as a growth machine, and the zero sum game that comes from urban competition between areas. Two observations on Amazon HQ2. One, we went through all of that hullabaloo, all that song and dance just for Amazon to decide that they should be located in DC and New York, right? The economic capital of the country and the political capital of the country. Wow, I'm stunned that that's how it came together. But secondly, Amazon proved something very valuable from the perspective of capital, which is that you can turn cities against each other and get just about anything you want if you're wise and smart enough at doing it. So yeah, Detroit went heavy into this. I know Indianapolis, Columbus, Atlanta, Dallas, many cities really, really went hard at Amazon to try to lure them there. But do you really think that would have fixed all your problems? Do you really think that one thing was going to solve every problem with your city? I personally think that everybody who participated in that should be ashamed of themselves. And instead, I just think a more sustainable strategy and an easier strategy is to just focus on what is locally possible. Just build a more locally pleasant city. Where are places where people like to be? Okay, build off of that. Where are people getting a quality education? Okay, let's work on that. Do we have a broad mix of housing options for the various groups of people that call the city home? Okay, great. Let's work on that. You can do that a lot cheaper than the tax breaks and the incentives and the things you have to do to get Amazon to give you the rose at the end of this. It was kind of like watching that whole thing unfold. It was kind of like watching The Bachelor, except it wasn't entertaining. It was actually just made me sad for everything about the future of urban areas. focus, like avoid these magic bullets and focus locally. And that leads me to and economic mobility. Pardon me. Before I move on, do cities offer nice places to live? Right, it doesn't have to be great places to live, just nice places to live, a quality education, a variety of housing options, so you don't have to move out of the city the second your kids turn 5. And do you have a chance? Do you have a reasonable chance at achieving socioeconomic mobility? Cities that can do those 4 things will do better than the cities that bend over backwards to attract capital, all in the name of jobs, all in the name of counting up the jobs. Now, jobs are important. I get that, but jobs can be created by people other than just growth machines and local growth regimes. Okay, and the groups that are always the best at thinking locally and building locally and working locally are your institutions, because people can move, institutions don't. So I would encourage cities to really invest in community institutions, because that's the group that tends to be the closest to the people that they serve, kind of like my idea about if mayors ran the world. This is going to be especially important because we know that cities have been corporatized and they have been financialized. So if banks and major corporations are the key urban actors that we care about, you're going to get a corporatized, financialized city. But if you have one that's built around the needs of local institutions, you will, by proxy, have a city that's built around the need of local populations. Okay, so instead of focusing on the bottom line, will the people, what institutions tend to focus on is something more than just what's the exchange value? What is this land going to be worth in 10 years? Instead, are the people who live in this work and work in this area, are they going to be happy? Are they going to be healthy? Are they going to be good citizens? One of my big fears is for the future of libraries, and not just because my mom is a librarian and that's how she makes money. No, one of my big fears, think about what the library does. The library is a local institution that isn't going to move. It isn't going to close down, we hope. But also, the public library is one of the only places left that we have where it is acceptable to go there for long stretches of time without spending a dime. You don't have to spend any money. I don't want to let that go. It's the most important function that libraries serve. It's a place where we can go locally for long stretches of time and no money has to be spent. And the public library, we will reduce its importance at our own risk. Okay. And then finally, I guess this is my biggest thing. This is less than, if I'm thinking about the future of cities. The 20th century is defined by the automobile. It remains to be seen what the 21st century will be defined by as. Currently, the first 20 years, it's still been defined by the automobile. But my hope is that that's changing. So here's my big last argument I want to leave you with. Invest in people, not in infrastructure. And if you invest in infrastructure, you want that infrastructure to be an investment in people. And so to me, there's a lot of things. It's very common for people like me to say, oh, that right there, that was the defining thing of the 20th century. And to me, so, I get that your mileage may vary here, but to me, the fundamental inflection point where the 20th century took on the shape that it was going to take on was the moment that cars were given preference over pedestrians. And what was that moment? Was there an actual moment when that happened? Actually, there is. And it was with the invention of the 3 signal traffic light, red, yellow, green. Because what did that do? That put a dedicated time for cars to drive through an intersection, and then a much shorter dedicated time for pedestrians to cross. Now, I'm not saying let's go back and murder Henry Ford when he's a baby, so that way we never get the mass production of the automobile. But let's understand that the city being built around the car is a decision. And from there, we got redlining, right? Freeways and people's ability to leave the city, we got redlining. We got a gutted urban school system. We got segregated environments. We got the natural ecological boundaries of freeways to divide neighborhoods from one another. We guaranteed ourselves dysfunctional public transportation. We got the war on drugs because it allowed suburban residents to divorce themselves from the fates of urban residents. We got spatial mismatch. We got skills mismatch out of this. So what I want you to think, if you're able, right, from this point on, if you can think yourself right now, like just what is going to be the fundamental inflection point of the 21st century? If you could think of something, like what do you think is going to be the defining characteristic or inflection point that creates the cultural reality of the 21st century? Write it up in about a paragraph and email it to me. And if you do that, granted, nobody's got a crystal ball, but if you do that, I'll make sure I throw a couple of bonus points your way on the final average that I'll be calculating soon. Yeah, that's what I got. Thanks very much. Understand that actions have consequences. Understand that the city is an environment, but it's also something that we can use. Do we want to use it for people or do we want to use it for capital? How can we encourage partnerships there that will get us better outcomes? I'm starting to ramble, so bye-bye. I'll see you on Wednesday with final wrap-up thoughts about the paper. Thank you very much, and bye.